Title: The Nose Author, Ryunosuke Akutagawa. Everyone in Ikinu knows of Zenshi Naigu's nose. It is about 5 or 6 sun, 5 to 6 inches, long, hanging down from above his upper lip to below his chin. It is uniformly thick from base to tip. In short, a long sausage-like thing dangles right from the middle of his face. The Naigu, who is now over 50, has been tormented inwardly by this nose from his days as a novice monk up to his current position as an inner dojo attendant, palace chaplain. Outwardly, of course, he pretends it does not bother him at all. This is not merely because he feels it is wrong for a monk, who should be eagerly devoted to the future Pure Land, to worry about his nose. Rather, it is because he despises the thought of others, knowing he is self-conscious about it. Above all else, the Naigu dreaded the word nose coming up in everyday conversation. There were 2 reasons why the nose was such a burden to him. First, its length was practically inconvenient. For one thing, he could not eat meals alone. If he tried, the tip of his nose would plunge straight into the rice in his metal bowl. Therefore, he had one of his disciples sit across from him during meals to hold his nose up with a wooden board about 1 inch wide and 2 feet long. However, eating like this was by no means easy for either the disciple lifting it or the Naigu having it lifted. Once, a middle-ranking acolyte who took over this duty sneezed, his hand shook, and he dropped the nose into the porridge, a story that was widely rumoured even in Kyoto at the time. Yet this was not the main reason the Naigu suffered over his nose. He truly suffered because his self-esteem was deeply wounded by it. The townspeople of Ikinu used to say it was a good thing Zenshi Naigu was a monk, for surely no woman would ever become the wife of a man with such a nose. Some even criticized him, speculating that he only entered the priesthood because of it. The Naigu, however, did not think his monastic life made the suffering caused by his nose any less. His self-esteem was far too delicate to be settled by a resulting fact like marriage. Thus, he tried both active and passive methods to restore his injured pride. First, he considered ways to make his long nose appear shorter than it actually was. When no one was around, he would face the mirror, looking at his face from various angles, earnestly trying to devise a solution. Sometimes just changing the angle of his face was not enough to satisfy him, so he would rest his chin on his hand or press his finger against his chin, peering patiently into the mirror. But never once did his nose look short enough to satisfy him. At times, the harder he tried, the longer it seemed to look. On such occasions, he would put the mirror back in its box with a heavy sigh and reluctantly return to his sutra desk to chant the Canon Sutra. Furthermore, the Naigu was constantly preoccupied with other people's noses. Ikinu Temple often hosted monastic feasts and lectures. Monks' quarters stood closely together within the compound, and water was boiled daily in the bathhouse by the temple monks. Consequently, a great number of monks and lay people came and went. The Naigu persistently scrutinized the faces of these people. He wanted nothing more than to find even one person with a nose like his, so he could feel at ease. Therefore his eyes noticed neither the dark blue Swicken robes nor the white hemp garments. Citrus orange hats and dark grey robes were so familiar they might as well not have existed. He did not look at the people, he only looked at their noses. But while there were hooked noses, he could not find a single nose like his. As this failure repeated itself, his heart gradually grew displeased again. While talking to someone, he would unthinkingly pinch the tip of his dangling nose and then blush unbefittingly for his age, an act driven entirely by this displeasure. Finally, he even hoped to find some consolation by discovering a figure with a nose like his in Buddhist or secular texts. Yet, nowhere in the scriptures did it say that Maudgalyayana or Sariputra had long noses. Nagarjuna and Asvaghosha, too, were bodhisattvas with ordinary noses. When he incidentally heard a story from China that Liu Bei of Shuhan had long ears, he thought of how much less miserable he would feel if only it had been a long nose. It goes without saying that while making these passive efforts, the Naigu also actively tried methods to shorten his nose. He did almost everything possible in this regard. He tried boiling and drinking snake gourd. He tried rubbing mouse urine on his nose, but no matter what he did, his 5 or 6 inch nose still dangled over his lip just the same. Then, one autumn, a disciple monk who had travelled to Kyoto on the Naigu's errands returned having learned a method to shorten long noses from an acquaintance who was a doctor. This doctor was a man who had come over from China and was serving as an attendant monk at Chorakuji Temple at the time. As usual, the Naigu feigned indifference, pretending not to care about his nose, and deliberately avoided saying he wanted to try the method immediately. On the other hand, during every meal, he would casually mention how pained he felt to be such a burden to his disciples. Inwardly, of course, he was waiting for the disciple to persuade him to try the treatment. The disciple naturally saw through this scheme. However, rather than feeling resentment toward it, the disciple was likely moved to deeper sympathy by the fragile mindset that drove the Naigu to use such a ploy. Exactly as the Naigu expected, the disciple passionately began to urge him to try it. And, just as expected, the Naigu eventually yielded to this earnest advice. The method was extremely simple. Boil the nose in hot water, and then have someone trample on it. Water was boiled every day in the temple bathhouse. The disciple immediately fetched boiling water, so hot one could not even dip a finger in it, in a bucket from the bathhouse. But dipping the nose directly into the bucket risked burning his face from the steam. So they decided to cut a hole in a wooden tray, use it as a lid for the bucket, and lower the nose into the water through the hole. As long as only the nose was immersed in the hot water, it was not hot at all. After a while the disciple spoke. "It should be boiled by now." The Naigu smiled wryly, thinking that anyone hearing this would never guess they were talking about a nose. Steamed by the boiling water, his nose itched as if bitten by fleas. When the Naigu pulled his nose out of the hole in the tray, the disciple immediately began trampling on the still steaming nose with both feet, pressing down with all his might. The Naigu lay on his side, his nose stretched out on the floorboards, watching the disciple's feet moving up and down right before his eyes. The disciple occasionally looked down sympathetically at the Naigu's bald head and asked, "Does it hurt?" The doctor said to stomp on it forcefully, "But does it hurt?" The Naigu tried to shake his head to show it did not hurt, but because his nose was being stepped on, he could not move his head as he wished. Glancing up at the cracked skin on the disciple's feet, he answered in an irritated voice, "It doesn't hurt." Actually, having his itchy nose stepped on felt rather pleasant instead of being painful. After trampling on it for a while, millet-like bumps began to form on the nose. It looked like a plucked bird roasted whole. Seeing this, the disciple stopped his feet and muttered to himself, "I was told to pull these out with tweezers." Puffing his cheeks in dissatisfaction, the Naigu silently let the disciple do as he pleased. Of course, he recognized the disciple's kindness. Yet, despite knowing this, he found it unpleasant to have his nose treated like an object. Looking like a patient undergoing surgery by a doctor he did not trust, the Naigu reluctantly watched as the disciple used tweezers to pull fat from his nose's pores. The fat came out in shapes resembling bird feather shafts, about 4 millimeters long. Once this was entirely done, the disciple let out a sigh of relief and said, "Now we just have to boil it one more time." With his brow furrowed in a displeased scowl, the Naigu continued to obey the disciple. When he took his nose out after the second boiling, it had indeed become remarkably shorter. It now looked no different from an ordinary hooked nose. Stroking his shortened nose, the Naigu timidly peeked into the mirror the disciple handed him, feeling somewhat awkward. The nose, that nose which had once hung down below his chin, had shrunk almost miraculously, and was now barely maintaining its last gasps above his upper lip. The mottled red spots were likely marks from where it had been trampled. With it like this, surely no one would laugh any more. The Naigu in the mirror blinked in satisfaction at the Naigu outside the mirror. However, for the rest of that day, he felt anxious that his nose might grow long again. So, whether he was chanting sutras or eating meals, he would reach out whenever he had a spare moment and gently touch the tip of his nose. But his nose sat well behaved above his lip, showing no signs of dangling any lower. When he woke up early the next morning after a night's sleep, the The first thing he did was stroke his nose. It was still short. For the first time in years, he felt a liberating sense of relief, akin to accumulating the merit of copying the Lotus Sutra. However, within a few days, the Naigu discovered an unexpected reality. A samurai who visited the Ikinu temple on business stared at the Naigu's nose continuously, looking far more amused than before, barely even speaking properly. Not only that, but the acolyte who had once dropped his nose into the porridge passed by him outside the lecture hall. At first he looked down to suppress his laughter, but evidently unable to hold it in, he suddenly burst out laughing. More than once, low-ranking monks who listened respectfully, while receiving orders face-to-face, would start snickering the moment the Naigu turned his back. At first, the Naigu interpreted this as people reacting to his changed face, but that explanation alone did not seem sufficient. Of course, the root cause of the acolyte and monk's laughter must have been right there, but their laughter somehow had a different quality to it than when his nose was long in the past. One could argue that an unfamiliar short nose is more comical than a familiar long one, but there seemed to be something else to it. They didn't laugh so blatantly before. Stopping midway through chanting a sutra, the Naigu would tilt his bald head and mutter this to himself. At such times, the lovable Naigu would gaze blankly at the portrait of Samantabhadra hanging nearby, remembering the days when his nose was long just a few days prior, and sink into depression, like one completely fallen into ruin reminiscing about a glorious past. Unfortunately, the Naigu lacked the insight to answer this question. Human hearts harbor two inherently contradictory emotions. Naturally, everyone sympathizes with another's misfortune. Yet, when that person somehow manages to overcome their misfortune, onlookers feel a vague sense of dissatisfaction. To exaggerate slightly, they might even harbor a desire to plunge that person back into the same misfortune. And before they know it, they develop a certain passive hostility toward the person. The reason the Naigu felt a vague displeasure, even without knowing why, was simply because he implicitly sensed this egoism of the bystanders in the attitudes of the monks and lay people of Ikinu. Consequently, the Naigu's mood worsened day by day. He scolded everyone spitefully at the slightest provocation. Eventually, even the disciple who had treated his nose began speaking ill of him behind his back, saying, "The Naigu will be punished for the sin of greediness toward the Buddhist teachings." What angered the Naigu the most was the mischievous acolyte. One day, hearing a dog barking frantically, the Naigu casually stepped outside to find the acolyte wielding a 2-foot-long piece of wood, chasing around a skinny, shaggy dog. And he wasn't just chasing it. He was jeering, "Don't let your nose get hit. Here, don't let your nose get hit," while chasing it. The Naigu snatched the wooden piece from the acolyte's hand and struck him hard across the face. The piece of wood was the wooden slat from before. The Naigu actually came to resent his nose having been shortened. Then came a certain night. The wind seemed to have picked up suddenly after sunset, and the ringing of the pagoda's wind chimes carried to his pillow, almost too noisily. Moreover, the cold had worsened significantly, leaving the elderly Naigu unable to fall asleep no matter how hard he tried. Lying awake in bed, he suddenly noticed his nose itching unusually. Touching it, he felt it was somewhat swollen with moisture. It even seemed feverish in that one spot. "Maybe it got infected because I forced it to be short," the Naigu muttered, holding his nose with the reverent gestures of someone offering incense and flowers at a Buddhist altar. The next morning, when he woke up early as usual, he saw that the temple's ginkgo and horse chestnut trees had dropped their leaves overnight, making the garden bright as if paved with gold. Perhaps due to frost on the pagoda's roof, the 9-ringed spire glittered dazzlingly in the faint morning sun. Zenshi Naigu stood on the veranda with the lattice shutters raised and took a deep breath. It was at this moment that a certain sensation he had almost forgotten returned to him. The Naigu hastily reached for his nose. What his hand touched was not the short nose from the night before. It was his old long nose, dangling 5 or 6 inches from above his upper lip to below his chin. The Naigu realized his nose had grown long again overnight. And at the same time, he felt a liberating, bright feeling, the exact same feeling he had when his nose first became short, returning from nowhere. With it like this, surely no one will laugh anymore, the Naigu whispered to himself in his heart, letting his long nose sway in the dawn autumn wind.